Alright everyone, so here we are in the build mode with the Mosquito rebuild. Now, it's got to be said, I think if you're going to do a rebuild, you need to start by sort of just focusing on what you... Take a look at the craft that you want to rebuild and focus on what you actually want to change. Now the first thing that I have to point out about this thing is that it is incredibly slow, averaging between 8 and 15 meters a second. There's really no reason why something this small couldn't move twice as fast. So that's one thing that I want to point out. Another thing that I want to point out is that when this thing is in full swing, its heat signature jumps up to an average of between 7 and 10, which isn't too bad, but there's one jet in particular that spikes up to about 80 degrees, and that is a very easy lock for any infrared signature. If I can keep it all like sub 20 with the average temperature of the vehicle a lot lower, then we'll do a lot better. So that's heat signature is one of the problems compared with speed. The other thing, it's made out of metal and it can't take any hits, so clearly the armor isn't working, which means the armor isn't really needed. I might be able to switch it all over to wood, make it a little bit lighter, a little bit faster, but that's still not going to fix the heat signature problem. So that's two things that I want to fix. It's currently sitting at 9.6 thousand resources, so just under 10k. And yeah, I'm not happy with its speed. I'm not happy with its heat signature, and I'm not happy with its durability. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refit this design. Now, I did figure out exactly why it was tipping over. It was tipping over because when it switched between targets, it didn't have enough roll control. Now, that's a fixable problem, definitely, for sure. But there's more to improve on this craft than just that. So we've currently got 100,000 resources. I'm going to look to upsize this thing a little bit. I'm going to look to reshape it a little bit, because right now it's called the Mosquito, but it's really just a little bit of a flying whale sort of shape with a huge tail fin. So yeah, I want to spread it out a little bit more. I want to change up the guns a little bit more. I'm thinking about switching them from these casemates over to these 3.7 inch guns, these 94 millimeter guns instead of these 150 to improve the fire rates, because that was another issue that this was running into, is the recoil was really bad on these things, and the overall, if I dropped the weight by switching it to wood or light alloy, the recoil on these would just mess it up even more. So I want to drop to some smaller guns with some faster fire rate. I want to change up the shells. I want to redesign the craft. I want to make it a lot faster, and I want to make it so that it doesn't flip over when it changes targets. And all of that is just, it's worth doing a redesign. I also decided that with the Mosquito in particular, I wanted it to be entirely battery powered. I didn't want it to be, I didn't want it to have an engine, and I think that this will help me drop the heat signature by a whole bunch. So what I'm looking to do with the new design is to drop it so that the average heat signatures of the jets is much lower to make it harder to target. I'm going to add in probably a small set of flares, because this will be a larger design, much more worth protecting than the others. And then I'm going to make it more stable and change up the weapons. So I have already kind of fallen in love with the initial shape. I wasn't sure how that was going to turn out, if it was going to look too lanky or whatnot, but the applique lets me fill in a lot of the empty space whilst still leaving some of those gaps, making this feel like it's more of an insect than like a whole craft. So gotta say, I'm loving the look of it. Now you might say, you might wonder a little bit if I've downsized the weapons, or if I've reduced the weapons. The answer is no. So the damage potential of those two weapons is actually pretty comparable. The difference is the 150mm casemate has some better range, slightly higher damage potential, and a lot more recoil. So I've switched over to this 94mm gun, because it fires a lot faster and it weighs a lot less. But they honestly, this costs slightly more. So this is more firepower than I used to have. It's just going to be over a higher fire rate with some slightly smaller weapons. Aha! Editing the cargo, jumping in here with a surprise message to catch you off guard. If you are liking the series so far, do me a favor, press the YouTube buttons. You know you know the ones. Don't pretend you don't know the ones. Okay, you know the ones. Anyways, I'm having an absolute blast making this, so I want to give a shout out and a thanks to everyone who is watching this. And yeah, anyway, that's all Editing the Cargo has for you. This is also a bit of an experiment because I've never really made vehicles that were fully armored in applique before. What I'm hoping here is that it'll deal with the occasional small frag, light hit, or weak explosion. I'm not honestly expecting this thing to be very durable. It's still going to be relying on distance and speed and small size to evade enemy attacks. However, I kind of hope that the applique can shake off some incoming attacks. You might also have noticed that I built a lot of the body out of this thing out of straight up AI connectors. The reason for that is actually pretty cool. So there is an AI detection block that detects communications between enemy AIs. And to think of, let me just go over here really quick. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but it's a wireless snooper. And the wireless snooper, if your AI if the AI on your vehicle has a transmitter or a receiver, the wireless snooper can pick up its exact location pretty accurately too. So by making the whole thing out of directly connected AI blocks, I actually make it invisible to wireless snoopers, which is really cool as far as I'm concerned. I think it's a really cool way to make things stealthy, and stealthy is the way that you make small craft good. It took me a long time to figure this out. Why was it that my tanks or small planes were just getting shot down? I thought they were hard to see, and the answer was I was putting inter-vehicle transmitters on all of them, and everything could just see them. So, yeah, avoiding the use of wireless receivers and wireless transmitters is a pretty good idea on anything you want to be hard to see, as well as just, reducing cross-section for radar return and all of the little tricks that I'm using to lower my average heat. And then, I've gone into a little bit of a combat test. Right now we're sitting at about 12 or 13k materials. So about 6 or 7 of these should be a fair fight for the Atlas, but it looks like these 4 are going to take it down. And one of them actually took several shots to the face, and it's still not out. So, yeah, I chose the Atlas because the Atlas's guns should be really good against a craft like this. I didn't want to just pick a health pool to test them against. I wanted to pick a design that I was likely to run into that would actually be dangerous for these things. The Atlas has a pair of flak guns on it, which have been absolutely decimated. In fact, this is kind of beautiful, watching this just hail of fire come from a couple of small ships. Yeah, I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with that. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, here we are with the final comparison. Now, just to reiterate, the Mosquito over here weighs about 4.7 tons, costs 9.6k materials. It has a heat signature that spikes up to 75 degrees on one point with an overall average of 7. It also has a fuel engine, and it averages between 8 and 15 meters a second when it's moving. It also can't stay upright when there are multiple targets. Now, over here, I have dubbed this one the Skeeter. We've changed the name a little bit because it's changed just so drastically. As we can see, first off, it has a smaller front profile than the Mosquito, making it harder to hit. It also comes in at a resounding 12.3k materials, so it is about 2,500 more materials more 2,500 materials more expensive. However, it only comes in at about 3 tons. Now, the weight doesn't usually matter for stuff like this, but the reason why I'm bringing up the weight is because I wanted this thing to be evasive and I wanted it to be efficient. So given that I've dropped the weight, it now takes less thrust in order to keep this thing flying. I've also revamped the armor scheme. I've gone for basically an applique coating. Now, this is not perfect. Fragments can do a lot of damage here. Anything that hits can go through this pretty easily. However, the problem with the Mosquito is that there are huge gaps in the armor wherein an explosive could wrap around and just disable the whole thing. Not to mention cut off an engine and just leave the thing spinning. So, what's nice about this is that there aren't such large gaps that can disable the entire craft. I also have to say I put a huge emphasis on the aesthetic of this. I wanted it to look like it deserved the name Mosquito or Skeeter. I didn't want it to look like a flying whale that some genius named Mosquito, which is kind of what happened over here. Now, the reason I've switched guns is primarily because of the weight change, actually. The 150 millimeters over here, already, even though this craft was heavy, they already had so much recoil that they helped to knock this thing off balance, and that was a no-no. So, by shifting down to these 94 millimeter guns, going for fire rate over raw power of the shell, it's actually a lot more controllable. The other thing that I want to point out is that we have the ability to see incoming missiles, as well as a very small flare system that'll fire radar, but mostly sticky flares, so that infrared seeking missiles won't hit this, and hopefully radar seeking missiles won't either. This thing has a really small radar return, so I think the one radar simulator here should do it pretty well. We're actually just going to change that to firing line. But yeah, all things considered, it has a much better armor scheme. It uses a lot less resources per second just to stay flying. And the best part, if we take a look at the internals, is that it actually runs off of an electric engine. It has 120,000 total energy, and it uses between 20 and 40 a second to stay flying. This thing can stay operational for hours without needing to come back and recharge. And that is absolutely wonderful. It does not have an RTG on it, but honestly, I don't think it needs one. You could even argue. In fact, it's such a good point. I'm going to make one last final change. It does not need the ability to operate for hours. So let's just downsize the battery here and add in some material storage, because why not? That's probably a better plan for it anyways. We'll have it keep just a little bit of material so that it can harvest the corpses of its enemies while it fights. But yeah, this thing, I'm really happy with how it turned out. It won't flip over. It is much, much more stable in terms of roll and in terms of pitch. As far as the heat map, I want to show you this. If we go over here, this screen can look really intimidating. And it's also not accurate because the PIDs are trying way too hard to fix everything. But 6 of our engines have a tendency to sit, or 4 of them have a tendency to sit around 20 degrees, and then 2 of them go back and forth between 20 and all the way up to 40 degrees at their biggest spikes. But they don't stay there. So all things considered, we have half the heat signature that we used to have. The craft is also sitting at an average of 2 degrees, whereas the other one was sitting at 7. So it is a much, much smaller infrared signature, much smaller radar signature. It's much better armored, and it's twice as fast. This thing goes between 15 and 30 meters a second. I dare say the Skeeter here is actually a good craft, whereas this is kind of just a bit of a thrown together thing. So yeah, I'm really happy with the rebuild, and this video might end up being a little bit long, but I figure some people are looking for From the Depths tutorials, and others just want to know what's happening in the adventure mode. So I figured I'd take my time to explain what's going on in case anyone is interested in learning. So yeah, this has been the rebuild of the Skeeter. I've got a couple more sub-vehicles I'm planning on building, and I'm always looking for suggestions. To start with, I think I'm going to do a small sub, and I think I'm probably going to put some torpedoes on it, but for the most part, I think I want the sub to be either an escape vehicle or sort of a boarding vessel that I can detach from my main ship and go out on an adventure. Speaking of boarding vessels, it should be noted, I also have a chair and a heartstone on the Skeeter. So if a Skeeter ends up in a useful position, and I can get, and I can teleport onto the Mosquito, I can take manual control of it, have it patrol, move, and yeah, I can use it to board enemy craft. Or perhaps just to escape. It's got to be said, this thing could fly for hours, so if our main craft is going to get destroyed, I might be able to bail out onto one of the Mosquitoes and flee. I do intend to run this adventure mode as a hardcore experience. So, hardcore meaning if I die, I die. So, yeah. We also have this tiny little flare launcher. If you don't know how to set these up, basically, I have a staggered fire. This is optional. A missile controller. This is required. A small launcher that fires some sticky flares with a radar target sim. And an automated control block where if my craft detects missiles, it fires these off. Over here, I have a passive radar. What this means is that if missiles using a radar sensor are coming towards my craft, I will detect them. And this is a munition warning system that will just detect other things. Unfortunately, there's not an infrared variant of this, but these are the two ways that you can detect incoming missiles. So I have those attached to my AI, and yeah, if there's missiles flying straight at this thing, it can fire some flares to protect itself. So yeah, huge upgrade as far as I'm concerned. I greatly look forward to deploying a number of them in the adventure mode soon. That being said, I've been Sicargo, and this has been fun, and I'll see you next time with more From the Depths.